Hello to this amazing audience. I'm honored to be asked to present my work to you. The talk will focus today on a key post-independence choice point, whether or not to promote Indigenous languages to official status in education and administration, and the consequences of that choice. One challenge for the newly independent Africa was overcoming the European cultural yoke. There was this ideology of negritude. Its origin was with Aimé Césaire in his Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal of 1939, developed by Léopold Senghor, representative of the French National Assembly, elected member of the Académie Française, and first president of Senegal. And here from his poem, Paris in the Snow, where he mourned the white cold that burns worse than salt, and the white hands that filled the high forest that dominated Africa, and his vision, let black blood flow, that it may rub the rust from your Paris's steel joints. Other first-generation leaders followed suit, promoting cultural symbols that signal authenticity and nation building. Julius Nyerere translated Julius Caesar into Swahili to demonstrate that Indigenous African languages are appropriate for elaborated and not just restricted codes. Other African leaders promoted name changes. Gold Coast became Ghana, connecting it to a great African empire. Joseph Mobutu, with his ideology of authenticity, changed his name or Africanized his name and that of his country. Thomas Sankara, with Opera Volta becoming Burkina Faso, citizens became Burkinabe, mixing Jola, Pool, and Mossi, thereby creating a national identification. And a Somali intellectual created an indigenous script, Usmania, for the national language. But there was a neocolonial reality. In no sub-Saharan African country does an indigenous language have a preeminent position in secondary education, upper levels of the civil service, or modern business. And save for Ethiopia, Somalia, and Tanzania, no country has offered the entire span of primary schooling in an indigenous language. Calls from intellectuals such as Ngugi in decolonizing the mind have had little impact on public policy. Rajesh Ramachandran and I, to illustrate this situation, developed an algorithm which we call the average distance to the official language, or ADOL. ADOL in a country is based on each language group's population share and its language distance from the official language, as defined in its use for writing the Constitution and basic laws, and computed by its address in Ethnologue's tree of world languages, whether it is from a different language family or merely a related dialect. For most African countries, ADOL, given that English and French are of a different language family, is at a maximum value of 1. And if we look at this chart to the right, the average distance to the official language by region, sub-Saharan African countries on average have an ADOL score of 0.83, a median ADOL score as a maximum of 1. Compare that to South Asia, 0.34, Latin America and Caribbean, 0.18, East Asia and Pacific at 0.17. The ADOL score for the average African country is much higher than for the average country in all other continents, and suggesting a near maximum disconnect in Africa between indigenous languages and the official language of education and administration. So what were the cultural consequences of linguistic status quo? That was the major part of my doctoral dissertation. I conducted a field experiment in Wajir in northeastern Kenya. I worked with bilingual secondary students in Somali and English, and I quasi-randomly paired them for role-playing sessions. Half were assigned the role-playing sessions in English, and half were assigned in Somali. In one of those role-playing sessions, there was a headmaster and teacher with opposing views about a preparatory exam for O-levels. The headmaster pushed for a hard exam to demonstrate challenge. The teacher pushed for an easier exam to build student confidence. How was this resolved? Through authority, who had the right to decide which exam to give, or pedagogy, which would be better for the kids? My hypothesis was that in an egalitarian culture, as Somalia was, in an egalitarian language, authority claims would be deemed inappropriate and hard to really say in Somali. In English associated with the colonial state, authority claims would be deemed appropriate. And if you look to the right, what I found is authority-based claims in English were significantly used more than authority-based claims in Somali. Whereas when pedagogical claims, such as what would be better for the children's educational success, the Somali dialogues had many more pedagogical claims made by teacher and headmaster, and English far fewer. The data demonstrate that there was a cultural consequence of language choice. The way issues and politics would be discussed would be different and more, say, away from African traditional norms. But ADOL is not only associated with cultural differences, but it's also associated with inferior socioeconomic outcomes in cross-national data. In these figures below, average distance from the official language in cross-national statistical analysis, average distance from official language is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have cognitive test scores, we have life expectancy, we have log GDP and log output per worker, and all of them, as ADOL goes up, human development and economic success goes down. There was this association which was obvious in the data. But how does ADOL suppress human development? And here work by Rajesh Ramachandran and I tried to figure out what the channels were between ADOL and human development. We discussed and developed data on two channels. First, the exposure channel. We looked at data from the Southern and East African Consortium for monitoring educational quality. They did a survey of 40,000 students in 2,000 primary schools. 60% of the students failed to meet minimal reading levels. We took these data and controlled for parents' education and SES, and we found that kids who were exposed to English at home had significantly higher grades in reading. What this suggests is if English is used only in schools, the kids are learning much less in schools than they would if they heard English outside of the schools. And low exposure to English or French in home life meant less success in English and French in school life. We also identified a distance channel. Now, we couldn't do that in Africa because distance is virtually maximum, that is between indigenous languages and colonial languages in all African settings. We went to the Indian National Family Health Survey. We took a sample of second generation within India of interstate migrants to states with different official languages. Linguistic distance in Africa is much higher for north-south migrants going from the Dravidian to the Indo-European zone than for east-west migrants who stay within the Dravidian or Indo-European zones. On a variety of outcomes, use of mosquito netting, knowledge about AIDS, those whose parents moved north-south or south-north with high distance had worse outcomes than those that moved east-west with low distance. What we infer from these two channels is African students are burdened with both low exposure and high distance, which helps explain the lack of success of school in bringing about higher reading levels. So in conclusion, there are many reasons, historical and political, why newly independent African countries abjured the development of indigenous languages for education and administration. But the consequences of colonial inertia are significant. There's cultural autonomy issues, as I discussed in my field experiments in Kenya, and human development issues in issues of literacy and knowledge of health issues. There are alternative models for educational policy. Think of the small European states where national languages predominate, but all students receive excellent instruction in a world language, which serves them well in preparation for university and in the international job market, where an international language is a sine qua non. A great deal of aid has come to African states to improve education. Results, as we have seen, have not been optimal. This research suggests that colonial language media of instruction with low exposure to it outside of school is a likely culprit. Thank you so much for your attention.